Glember, The Tale of a Monster, written, recorded, and illustrated by A.K. Brookman. Table of Contents. The Introduction. Our tale begins in the heart of Meristherian, a treacherous and mysterious land surrounded by impassable mountains and maintained by the watchful hand of the wizards of Nye. Secluded and forgotten by the rest of the world, Meristherian struggles on as it long has. Few now know that life exists elsewhere. The secrets of Meristherian, you see, are as buried as the hearts of its inhabitants. Nothing gets in, nothing escapes. Unless you believe in the old legends. A great ancestor once asked me, "How, my son, how can you teach a monster to love?" When I was a child, I was afraid of the rain. The thunder terrified me. My father collected me one night when the rains came. Hearing my cries, he lifted me up to his lap and dried my tears with one of the linens he used to carry out in the fields to wipe his forehead. He sat with me in front of the windows, having thrown the shutters wide, and we stared out into the flashing darkness as the storm pounded against our farmhouse. He reminded me that the rains fed the crops we would eat, that the rain came because the earth called out to the skies and asked for it. He said it wasn't rain at all, but happy rain. Each rain that came, he gathered me with a look of excitement on his face and led me to the windows. He danced about and pointed up at the blinking heavens, laughing with glee. "Happy rain," he would hoot, "happy rain." And I learned to love the rain. Chapter 1. Lilly. "What is a gargle?" Lilly asked me. She was always so inquisitive. Others were curious at times, but intrigue for the world seems to die with age, and I found their questions subsided a little more come the spring rains each year. The sun was particularly low that day, and I was near exhaustion. I'd been working the field all the day, laboring the stones and the impossibly strong roots of the ancient shallot trees said to once inhabit the land. "Daddy," she asked again. She was always so persistent. "What is a gargle?" We'd heard of the savage beasts of the north, of course. Who hadn't? The stories of those settlers straying out alone in the fars were not pleasant. "They are monsters, Lilly," I answered, "and I hope we never see one." Lilly seemed to consider the answer, staring off into the north, her white dress moving slightly in the soft summer gale that swept over us. "Now go help Mommy," I said. "Tell her I'll be back soon, and we can sit together." She frowned. "We can talk more about gargles then," I offered. She smiled. Little inquisitive Lilly. I watched her skip away toward the house. I heard her yelling to her mother, "Mama." I couldn't make out the rest. Her mother was standing in the doorway, one hand placed delicately over her swollen abdomen. She disappeared into the house, perhaps content Lilly was coming back to the house safely. It was the rumor, you see. Someone had said a gargle was spotted in the area, though some doubted any still existed. Some doubted they had ever existed. Superstition or nay, the heat had an ominous effect. It swept across the land like a plague. The talk of taverns, the warning of the clerics, the fear of mothers. I watched Lilly slip into the house, saw my love close the door. I hoped she bolted it, I remember thinking. Lilly wasn't afraid of anything, you see. I knew we had to keep an ever-vigilant eye on her. It was the last time I saw them. I winced in pain. Mud clung fiercely to the back of my hand where the skin had been peeled back somehow during the struggle. I could not even remember how. Outside, the storm threw itself against the mountains. The gargle stood at the mouth of the cave, slightly hunched, and at times peering back through the gloom at me. I could see its coarse silhouette each time the lightning blazed across the sky in the distance. Though I had come to peace with the havoc of the heavens years ago, I was horrified at what this storm brought in. How had I gotten there, you ask? I shudder to relay. As night settled in, I made my way back to the house. Sassy was snorting and kicking. She'd been through many a storm without fear. Something had spooked her. I thought I heard a noise behind me, and though I began to turn, I stopped and shrugged it off. How ridiculous, I thought. I'd not let the work of the wind frighten me. I wasn't afraid of the tales, and I'd not let them get the best of me. I made it 3, perhaps 4 more steps when that strange sound came. It was like a sickly man sucking in a great lungful of air through a narrowed throat. Terror sunk into me like the fangs of a wolf. It was not simply nearby. This coarse inhalation resonated in my left ear. I think now I could feel the heat of its breath against my neck. The sound was not only ferocious as some wild beast, it sounded of anger, of willful hell. How fear seems to amplify reality, makes such memories difficult to discern. I felt nothing but dread. I tried to run, lunging forward as I threw my arm back in defense. Something struck against my head and sent me whirling up off the ground and through the air. I landed in the moist soil, buckling the dancing ryegrass that lined the path toward my hovel. There was a moment when I stared blankly at the ground before me, curious as to how I had gotten there. Quickly this was vanished. Something seized my ankle and dragged me off into the tall grass as I kicked and screamed, uprooting handful after handful of ryegrass from the sodden earth to no avail. Then my other ankle was clutched, and the attacking monster twisted the two in a violent jerking motion, turning me over. In the distress, I had slapped at the earth, and rainwater splashed up off the soil and into my eyes. I could hardly see already in the darkening late evening beneath the cloudy and starless canopy. Now I felt coarse grains of soil scratching my eyes with each blink. I fought with everything I had in me as my heart pounded thunderously in my chest. I took blow after blow in rapid succession. I fell time and again, kicking at the beast, striking its solid and hoary body over and over. It came on mercilessly, exchanging punishing strike after strike. The raw fear made me numb to pain, and yet I quickly grew tired. I suddenly could no longer lift my arm to defend myself. The lids of my eyes began to descend, despite my best efforts to end their passage. I knew I was still being struck because the view before me, though murky, jarred about in various ways until my eyes closed. Some time later I awoke, covered in pain, dirt, and fear, the gargoyle standing at the mouth of the cave. I was certain my life was at its end. You cannot know how hard the rock truly is until you've slept a night upon it, or worse, turned and shifted over it through a horrible night, a tumultuous, pained night, where the insides of you become so tight with fear, it seems a simple twist or turn will rip something in there, and the terror, great as it was, would not dim the burning Mars across my body. If I did not pull my limbs tight, I would shiver in the dank cold, and yet to pull them in was to endure the sting of their torn surfaces. I could not see well enough to dislodge the bramble embedded in my skin, and as I felt about for pieces and tugged at them, often a pain would scream from there before I could pull it free, so I was left wondering whether I had pulled stem or straw, or if it was a mangled shred of my own flesh. Nor could I turn my gaze away from the eerie cave mouth. I feared I would miss the lightning, or worse, I feared it would flicker, and the beast would no longer be in view, or suddenly I would find it looming just before my face. In the old world, if you were like to believe that time, it was said that sieves battled gargoyles for dominion in the west. The old tales relay that with dawn the sieves made hasty ground, their keen senses overwhelming the gargoyle hordes and beating them back. Come the night, however, the tide shifted. Sieves would fall to their deaths, having never known a fearsome foe approached. It was as though, some said, the shadows crawled out and over and around the gargoyle. And come morn, entire Sievan legions were found massacred, many who never knew to put up a fending block before it was too late. And yet giants, sieves, telk, dragons, and the like were only heard of in tales these days. Many began to doubt the old legends. The old men of the villages would swear they once saw such a creature, or that they battled one as a young man. I wondered, depleted of strength, both shuddering and shivering, frightened to sickness in that dreaded cave as the storm swept across the land, I wondered how much our village, nestled amid the mountains, kept us from the volatile and real world, complete with its perils and beasts. I wondered that death wore many more faces than old age and disease. In fact, some of the elders fancied the belief that our kind had been herded intentionally into the mountains as a haven from the wars that raged beyond our peaks, that we were kept here by powerful men, wizards, gods, I cannot recall, so that our race would endure past the chaos ensuing in the fars. I was never one to quarrel over such tales. Let the lazy men dodge the responsibilities of the day by arguing what they cannot entirely prove of past or future. I was content to enter the work of life than dispute its ends or beginnings, and perhaps I was not wealthy enough to have the books at my disposal for the arming. Let those ink-thumbed frailbacks work a day in my field, I'd say. My lovely wife, she'd roll her eyes as I stammered over such things, but I think it was why she truly loved me. I was an honest and hard-working man. It must have been enough for her. Jerking back to wakefulness with a pounding heart that quaked through my chest in that bleak, cavernous hell, I tried to think of her, my love, and yet my mind lost her with the noises in the dark, the feel of wind against my face that maybe the beast come to deal the death blow I held not the strength to thwart. A night can be so long. Once a peaceful and patient thing, night had grown cold and hateful. Its depth enhanced my delirium. The nail of my left middle finger, nearly torn free, seemed to snag painfully on every stone and thread of my clothes, and I could not find a way to remember to be careful with it. 10,000 of those damned stones for discomfort, and not a one of them larger than my thumbnail. Oh, of course I thought to find a weapon, but nothing was to be found. The closest I came was what felt like the bone of a small animal. When I lunged to the side in fright, it snapped against the rocky earth, and I was left with no defense but my own beaten limbs. Hey, I was left there with my sores and fears, and only an occasional and fleeting memory to comfort me from the real peril of my unfortunate predicament. Thoughts of Lilly, or my father's words of the happy rain, came and went with the flashing of the storm. I wondered how long I could hold on. How long could any man hold on? I've never been one to sleep when there was work to be done. I've been known to put off rest for far too long. I fell that day with weakness, my strength strewn over the field and the path the gargoyle dragged me across to reach this cave. There was scarce a drop of life left in me. How had the beast moved me in my sleep? Was I really so weak that I slept through it? I don't suppose it matters now anyway. The morning came as it always had, the sun reaching its arms down against the earth, while the birds and the early creatures began to chime the night away. Perhaps I had awakened earlier, but was too clouded in my exhaustion to recall. But I remember first a violent shove that demanded my immediate attention. I lay against the rock near the mouth of the cave, my hands and ankles bound. The gargoyle was not far, hunched over some strange contraption I would come to know all too well. He shoved a pin into part of it and pulled at its chains. I heard a click and watched as the gargoyle nodded at his work, seemingly satisfied. It turned to me then and grinned, perhaps delighted the throes of sleep no longer enfolded me. As it drew near, I turned my gaze down to the floor of the cave. I'd known wild dogs to accept such gestures as inoffensive, even submissive. I had no intention of confronting its strength and rage. I wanted to find a way home to my family alive, preferably without the passages of claws along my face as fond keepsakes. The gargoyle seized the back of my head, taking a clawful of hair, and forcing my gaze back up and toward the contraption he had dragged and dropped before me. He shook my head violently and resituated it so that I again faced forward, making it clear I was not to turn away. Content, he loosed his grip, drawing his hands back to his sides as he moved to stand before me and the heap of chains and metal. It was the first look I had of his claws. Each hand consisted of 3 great fingers, and he wore gloves over them with holes through which poked these scarred and thick-nailed fingers. He fumbled about, at last gripping the contraption properly, and held it out toward me with those terrible claws. And then he showed me how it worked. He held a sharp piece of metal. "Xiron," he muttered, grazing its tip along one of the links of the chain. It scraped the steel. It must have been impossibly strong, made of some material quite foreign to me. He threw the contraption over his shoulder, instructing me how it was to be worn. Removing it, he held it aloft before my eyes, and showed me how tugging at any one of the chains would cause the pointy barb to pierce the spine of its wearer. The lesson complete, the gargoyle laughed as he lifted me up with a single powerful arm. He was not mindful of my gaping wounds that broke open anew as he clasped the bindings on my wrists and ankles. He untied the ropes formerly keeping me, knowing well I understood the device. He stood before me and grinned again. If I tried to strike him, if I tried to run, if I tried to move my arms or legs forward more than the thickness of perhaps my fist past my chest, the Xiron spike would pierce my spine. And now the gargoyle drew near me. With his face beside my ear, he spoke in that grainy, rough voice of his. "I will take you back to my homeland. It will take 60 days, if you live that long." He leaned in closer now to me. "There, I will kill you in the Temple of the 8 Walls." He lifted a final clasp, braced it to my neck, and tugged violently at it, sending me staggering forward. I fell to the ground, mindful that to take a step wide enough to maintain my balance would send that merciless barb into my back. The gargoyle nodded in satisfaction and loosed a low laugh before kicking me and motioning me forward. It was a task to get to my feet without the use of extending my arms and legs, and throughout it, writhing about on that cave floor while the gargoyle watched curiously, perhaps amused at my state, my wounds seared with pain as the gravel went to work against me. Finally, I stood. The gargoyle looked to the ground beside me, and I followed his gaze. Blood from my shoulder was running down my arm, pattering the rock. I guessed he had plans to devour me then. Perhaps he was lost in some thought. Suddenly, he yanked again the chain to my neck shackle. I came forward with quick and small steps, managing to keep my balance this time. The gargoyle moved my arm forward, looking behind me. I could see now in the sunlight at last my shadow. I could see the spike moving toward my back as he moved my arm forward. I felt the point of it prick my back. The gargoyle tightened the brace that crossed my chest and abdomen. "Perhaps your spine is stronger than the Zyran human," he laughed. It sounded as though his throat and lungs were full of sodden oats. "Perhaps, if you swing with enough force, you'll break the Zyran and be free." I watched it mar the chain. I knew better, of course. "Have your sport, gargoyle," I said, "but I have done nothing to you, nothing to deserve this." The gargoyle's eyes narrowed. He yanked forcefully the chain bound my neck. It was a moment of fear. His eyes conveyed thoughts I knew, dark thoughts I surmised. I was certain he was considering whether to kill me there and be done with it. As if to confirm this, the gargoyle shook his head. "No," that raspy voice came. "I will wait for the temple," he said with conviction. "I will kill you there." A shudder ran over me. This monster was resolute. I was going to die. And I will admit to begging for my life, pleading to be let free. It was useless, all of it. He was oblivious my plea. It was as though I was already dead to him, that my life meant nothing any longer. He turned his gaze north toward the fars and tugged at the chains. And so the journey began, the walk to my death. I think it must have been there in the beginning, in that cave, when I first put my plan into motion. Nothing as clever as it was desperation. It may have been rooted in the rain, my father's words. That lesson had proved its vitality countless times before, for I knew I could not overpower this monster. If it took pity on me, I wouldn't have to. And surely, somewhere in there, if deep, this creature had some sense of compassion. Didn't all creatures? Surely I could get through to him. Surely not even the walls of a monster are so thick as cannot be broken down. Well, you cannot blame me for trying. It was my life after all. I had only 60 days. This concludes part 1 of 17 of Glember, The Tale of a Monster. You're listening to the first book of the Meristherian Trilogy. Please subscribe if you like the content, where you'll have access to additional books. Feel free to support this channel by telling others about it and dropping the link in your social media sites. These books are free to listen to, as you know, and everyone's welcome here. Leave a friendly comment if you like. Again, this is AK. Thanks for listening, friends, and see you next time.